Welcome to our webinar series on financial health for tribal producers. We had 2 webinars last week that the recordings are here on the Facebook page and then also posted elsewhere. We are doing our second 2 in the series today. And the one we're doing right now is Building Your Business Foundation Part 1, 10 basic questions that every livestock operation should consider. And then Part 2 will be following this webinar in 1 hour. Both of these will be available on the Facebook page's recordings after it. The whole series is part of a grant that we have from the Western Extension Risk Management Education Center, which is part of USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and is based upon this award that you can see the number there. And the project team consists of myself, Trent Tigerstrom, and Juan Arias from University of Arizona, and Vicki Hebb from the University of Nevada, Reno. So it's a group effort. We'd like to acknowledge, and it builds on a previous project that included the other acknowledgements here on the screen. And so let's just get right into it. Today, we're going over the 10 basic questions for livestock operations, and Vicki Hebb is going to take the lead on this presentation. And take it away, Vicki.
Okay, thank you, Ruby. I want to introduce Ruby Ward because, as she said, me instead of herself. She's at Utah State University. And so if you're just watching this one, this is a good one to watch as well. So we're going to go over 10 basic questions for livestock operations, meaning if you want to start a ranch, which is the general term for starting a livestock operation on our reservations, we want to go over some things that you really need to consider before you make that big jump. So we are going to try and make questions for you so you are prepared. We're going to do a checklist for you to consider. And then we will do some other webinars to build on this, because at the end of this series, we hope that you are ready to make a decision whether or not this is for you. All right, so the number one question, it's number one for a reason, because nothing is more important then do you have access to land? If you have no land, you cannot get cattle, you cannot get livestock, you cannot get sheep, you cannot get goats, nothing. The number one thing to have is land. Management decisions are crucial. If you have land, do you have the ability to make a management decision? Trent and I were talking about this earlier. Trent? You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so to make the management decisions on a timely manner and in a format that is beneficial to the business that you're starting in there, you have to be able to make those decisions at those critical times of when you need to make them. And if you have to go up in front of a board or a council or something to make this, make these decisions, you can do it, but it's a lot harder to do. So having that control at your level where you are in control of it is really beneficial. And we're not saying you have to actually own the land or any of this, but to access to it. So there's degrees of that. And that's what we want to try to get at here, is to make sure you have that, either in writing, everything else that you need.
Absolutely. And so when we are talking about that, we're talking about, like, is there a cattle association or community grazing, which a lot of reservations have, but there's some reservations that have leases or grazing permits. So if that's how your reservation works, on either of those, will you have access? How difficult is it to get a lease or a grazing permit? How difficult is it to become part of an association or community grazing? Juan, if you could weigh in on that a little bit. Our example on this would be San Carlos.
Yeah, if for example, if like San Carlos, several cattle associations that have control of the land, and they're able to make decisions on their boards and within their association. If that were to change, if they have to go through a committee or even the tribe, will take a long time for them even to get things done, and it'll hit heavily on their business. So it's something that they have to figure out if they're able to make decisions on time, if they have to go through a committee or through the tribe. If they have to do that, they have to have a streamlined process so the business can flourish.
And to be a member, so if they want to just have cattle and be a part of that association, there's different ways
Yeah,
that could work as well.
Yeah.
Such as?
They'll have to be part of an association depending on the district. That they pay a fee, and then they can have the cowboys or the board raise their cattle in a certain area, depending on what their agreements are, and they get a certain agreement with them. Each association is different.
So that's a really good segue to our last point here, and that is, do you have them now? Meaning, do you have access to grazing right now? I'm from South Dakota and Cheyenne River Sioux, and up here it's a catch-22. It's impossible to get a lease, but you can't get a lease without cattle. But how do you get cattle without a lease? So I think that's kind of what Juan is alluding to as well, is that, I mean, it can be a little bit tricky to get into it, but I think that that's one of the crucial things that you have to consider when going into this.
Okay. Yeah, we know land situations could be tricky, and we don't want to, we're not trying to make this as an overall get into a land discussion, because those can go on for a long time, but you do have to have the capacity to make those decisions and work through what you need to do as an operator, whether that be association or the actual land lease. So
yeah, definitely. So like I said, just to review on this one, this is the most important question that you could ask yourself. Okay, Ruby, next. Okay, so as we go through these questions, we're doing just how can I get better? Because at the end of this, we hope this is a working process as you're listening to this. So we have pictures here, but I mean, if you go and print out this PowerPoint, or if you're just taking notes, I mean, make a little list of how you can get better or something that you have to work on. Okay, next. After grazing, after grass, the next thing that is really important is, do you have access to required equipment for desired operation? Okay, so like with cattle, you need a chute. Not necessarily in Arizona, but in South Dakota, you have to, in Montana, almost a lot of places, you need to be able to feed your cows. And when I say that, I don't mean just grazing. I mean, when the snow hits, do you have a way to put out hay bales? Do you have a tractor? Do you have a bale feeder? Do you have a, you know, any of those mechanisms to feed your cattle? Do you have a trailer? If you have a sick cow, do you have a trailer to move your bulls out? A corral system, that is crucial for vaccinations, for when you're branding, for when you're maybe spraying for flies. You have to have a water trough. Do you have access to water? I mean, we're really in a pandemic right now, and you know, if you're a Navajo or Hopi, you may not even have access to water. Correct, Trent?
right, and I think what we're also talking about is water troughs, is the water systems across the land that we just talked about, right? You have access to that. So that's in that part, but when you come in, you need to work them or sort them, whatever you're doing with them, pulling the bulls off. If you do that, some areas like Arizona, it's year-round grazing, year-round breeding, but they do try to pull and try to manage some of those. And it's a lot easier to do that when you have corral system, water systems, which you can hold them off in areas and set up. So yeah, those are really important things to think about.
Absolutely. Juan, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think usually when it comes to water trout, it's important to know how many we have out there, and also it has to do with the grazing abilities up there. If we have just one in one area, most likely the cows are gonna be hanging out in that certain area, overgrazing that pasture. So want to make sure we're able to manage where the water is, so that way we can rotate the cattle.
Absolutely. And then next is fencing. Are the pastures fenced? Do they need fixed? Have they been maintained? You can go buy a herd of cattle, sheep, goats, whatever you want, but if you can't keep them in the area that is designated for you or that you're buying or paying for, you will lose animals, and that affects your bottom line. Correct, Trent?
Yeah, absolutely. And this happens all the time. You forget about the back pastures. The storm comes through, knocks trees down, animals, wildlife jump over, knock fences across and down. And so fencing is a constant thing with for farming and ranching. Ranching, you just have to do it, and you have to be on top of it and make those rounds the best you can to make sure that they're up, especially before you're turning out. Anytime you're turning out, you need to make those rounds ahead of time, planning ahead where you're going to move so you can go around and make sure that you have time to do it and you get it fixed so you know it's going to hold.
And by round, what he means is that whether you're in a side-by-side, a vehicle, or a horse, you go down every single line of fence and repair where it's down or loose or any of that.
And watch the ditches, make sure you have the draws covered, and if you're up against a rock wall, there's no gaps, these kind of things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And go ahead, Juan.
Yeah, when it comes to fire season too, if there's fires up there, it's really important that we do those rounds because sometimes those fences get burned down and we don't even know until a couple days later, and we end up losing some of that cattle in the operations.
Yes. And water gaps are huge, like Trent just said. And we could do a whole other webinar on water gaps. And please let us know if that's something you need. But for now, let's just say water gaps are probably the leading. And by a water gap, I just mean it's somewhere where the fence is here and you have a dip of land that cattle can get through very easily.
Yeah, and you have to kind of leave them open for the most, somewhat open to let the water flow, that it doesn't hang up in your fence and knock your fence down.
Yes.
So it's a balancing act there.
Absolutely.
Lots of interesting tricks to try to keep it.
I was just going to say it. Fire works really well. So. But that's what I was saying. That's a whole nother webinar. If we need to go out and do some water gaps, we can do that too. So again, on this question, just jot down what you need to look at. And if you're checking fences, if you have an existing pasture or access to one, this is a picture of my barn here, and you can just see like our home place just kind of has an ornamental fence, but we are definitely sectioned, and you can see my hay pasture down there as well. So
I will say too, is part of this how you can get better is look at your equipment. We're not saying that you have to have all brand new equipment at all, right?
yes.
It doesn't have to be the most pristine equipment out there, but it has to be functional and won't damage or hurt animals. So there's that balance on that stuff. So maybe you can improve one of those things. You don't have to improve them all, but if you have to have access to them, maybe you have to work with another individual who might have access to it that you can work with closely, so you don't have to, stage into it. Just as long as you have access to it. Doesn't mean you have to own it all.
No,
It doesn't have to be new.
It is such a great point.
When you're
Go ahead, Juan.
Yeah, when you're talking about equipment, it's also important if you're in an area where you don't have any type of communication and have a system where you can communicate with different departments. That way you know what's going on around the area, because that's something we have problems with usually in some of the areas in San Carlos.
And also I want to point out, a lot of times NRCS will have equipment for you to use free of charge. So you need to look at your resources, because you really have to think, if you need a piece of equipment, are you going to use it once a year? If you're going to use it once a year, you really don't need to buy it. Are you going to use it every day? Then yeah, you should probably consider. But again, don't buy new. This is not the stage. Although I'm going to be one to say never buy new. I do not believe in that at all. So, okay, next, do you have experience with livestock? Okay, so first of all, what is your experience? What made you want to get into this? Did you grow up on a ranch? Did you grow up watching the cowboys at San Carlos and what they're doing? Did you
You could have inherited part of
Yes,
this, right?
yes, that's what I was just going to
Yeah,
say. Did you
yeah.
come across an opportunity that
Yes.
you
Yes.
didn't know existed and now you're trying to maybe continue with it? So it's very important to understand where you are on the knowledge chain, because the next most important thing is your herd health. So fertility management, okay? So that means your cows have to be healthy enough to breed back every single year, because that is your cash crop. Okay, your cash crop means that's how you get paid. So the next thing after your cows, let's say your cows are all ready, that means they're in a good condition score, which means they're fat enough to breed back, but not too fat, because there is such a thing. But then your bulls, are your bulls,
Are they sound, or
yes,
they move?
yes,
There's mobility of them? Are
yes, thank you.
they
Yes.
healthy? There's vaccines up to date on cows and the bulls, so that's very important, because if you're not managing that, or you bring in a bull you don't know and they have something like trichomoniasis or something, you can lose all your calves, and you're done for that year. So.
And this goes back to a cost. You need to test your bulls for mobility of their sperm. Make sure that they're not, let's see, we call it shooting blanks, but
Infertile.
so, yes, infertile, but also, you know, at that time when you bring them in to test them, you can look at their feet, see if they need any kind of maintenance, make sure that their tool is straight and they are able to breed. And that leads us to vaccinations, because vaccinations are also very important, not only for your calves, but for your cows and your bulls, to make sure that they're healthy and going out there. And
your horses too.
well, yeah, absolutely. Because your horses are equally important to go check on things and to maintain your herd.
If you have them, there are probably some nations that you may not be required necessarily to have a horse to get around. If you can work the cows, four-wheelers, these kind of things. Most of the times in the West out here, in certain areas, horses are a must.
Yeah, for sure. And then next is tagging. So whether you live in a brand state or not, tagging is essential. It allows you to understand what calf belongs to what cow. It allows you to know when one dies. And this goes back to our sessions that we did last week, record keeping, because when you put a tag in a calf or a cow, you are able to keep an accurate record of whether they're alive or dead, as well as, you know, what vaccinations you've given to the herd. It is also extremely important in order to participate in USDA programs.
Yeah.
So tagging is very important as well. And then last is BQA, which is Beef Quality Assurance Program. And I'm going to let Trent talk about this a little bit.
Okay, so yeah, Juan and I can mention this. The Beef Quality Assurance is a training that allows you to get a certificate that talks about the herd health management and how to properly give vaccines, taggings that talks about and an instruction on the proper way to do this, the proper way to get all the vaccines, so you're following the protocols, and then you have those record systems in place, right? Because that's part of it as well. So it all leads up to what we just talked about up there on the tagging, the vaccinations, and the overall herd health management of it. That's the focus. And Juan does teach this. He's certified trainer in BQA.
Yeah, it's a foundational training that even if you haven't done it in years, it's really good to get a refresher course, especially for your cowboys that are managing the cattle up there, record keeping, care of husbandry practice, treatment, feed stuff, additives, management of the ranch up there is really foundational. It will help your sales, even if you have a small training like this. It doesn't cost much, and if you have the certificate, it's really good to put it up there for other buyers to see that you're actually managing your cattle right, and it kind of might even bring up your prices up too.
Absolutely. Okay, and last is range management. This is also another whole webinar, but let's just say that we want to manage our grass so that there is enough for the cattle to eat. That means rotating and different things like that. Okay, Ruby, let's keep going. Okay, well, yeah. So, do you have a livestock mentor or mentors that you can go to with concerns and questions? So a lot of people will have a family member. Maybe at San Carlos, you know, one of the cowboys, an association member is who that would be, a neighboring tribal member, anyone willing to help you understand livestock. And what we mean by this is, in a very short statement, someone that you can go to when you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
Understand a vaccination.
That's right. Somebody trustworthy, knows the industry, knows the cattle, you know they have a background in it, and so they can help you through these things. Sometimes it can be your tribal extension agent, FERTEP agent.
Absolutely.
Other times it can be your neighbor, like we talked about here. You just look around. There's people out there, and they're willing to help.
Absolutely. All right, next, Ruby. All right, next, do you know what type of operation you'll have? All right, this one could take a while, but let's try and be quick about it. But so what we're talking about it when we talk about cash crops is, what do you want your cash crop to be? Do you want cows and your calves are your cash crop? Do you want to run yearlings so you don't have to have cows? Same thing with steers. And then we need to circle back to where your point of sale is, meaning where will you sell them? Where's the local sale barn? How far is it from you? Or do you want to contract them? So Trent and Juan, let's circle back on this one.
Yeah, this is a bit loaded.
Number one thing for determining cow calf versus yearling.
Well, and the cow calf is the most common, right? That's where most everybody is. But if you're, and some of them are cow yearling, not cow calves. So in some cases, like in the Southwest, where it's year-round grazing, they will be all going all the way until their yearling stage. So you can have a cow calf, cow yearling, or you can just do yearlings. And yearlings is a little more flexible. So if you're in areas that have a lot of droughts and things like this, by doing yearlings, but it comes down to different management styles. So you have to do different things with yearlings and necessarily than you do with the cows. But and then some of them do the cow yearlings where it's a little mixed to where they, if a drought comes or if you have to pull your animals for any reason from a grazing permit that you might have, you don't lose all your cows, because those take, you know, you want your cows in your herd for at least 7 years or more, right? 6, right, depending on where you're at and everything.
And then you gotta cycle them out, but
yeah, you're cycling them out. But then on the yearlings, they're a lot more flexible, because you can sell them at the weight they are, and then if you want to buy new ones, you come in at you know, like 300, 400, 500, say 550 pounds or so, and then you can go them out to about 7 to 8. So it's just a shorter term.
yeah,
It's a way to get in there, get out. It's a little more flexible that way, but it's a completely different management style and everything you need to do. So there's a lot of pros and cons. It's what you're comfortable with. It's looking at your markets, look at where you're at from your resources as well, and what you have available and what you're doing.
Well, and let's go to Juan and talk about predators a little bit. I think that where you live and what your predators are definitely have an impact on that. Don't you think, Juan?
Yeah, there has to be a plan for that, especially when you're talking about tagging. Sometimes we don't know when something's missing because there's no records of it. So going back to the foundation of EQA, tagging and keeping records of what you have out there, it's very important. And also kind of, you have to have operation to see when you're going to get rid of your cattle and if you have a plan to sell out there.
But don't you think, Juan, that like in some areas, a yearling might be more predisposed to live than a calf,
Yes,
especially in your area that you're working in?
Yeah, they're susceptible to getting eaten by the Mexican gray wolf or other predators out there that are really hard to track down. And sometimes you don't even get a payoff from that because you have to be there physically seeing what's happening. Pictures will not work, so you have to account for that too.
Yes.
Yeah.
So kind of to review this slide, it's not only what you're able to do, but your environment as well.
Yeah.
Okay, Ruby. All right, do you know how you will feed the livestock under different weather conditions or natural disasters? So what we're talking about here is if you can't graze, so this crosses from Arizona to South Dakota to Montana to Florida because of different weather conditions. So sometimes you're gonna have to buy hay. You put up hay. Now with that one, I want to really focus on, in order to put up hay, you have to be able to put up a lot in order for it to justify you buying your equipment.
Yeah.
So that was put in there, but putting up hay is not really the best option if you have a small herd or you're just feeding a few. When you cash flow the expenses of repairs and fuel versus paying someone to bring you hay, a lot of times you're better off buying hay. Also, when we have extreme weather conditions, whether it's drought or a blizzard, a fire, yes, supplements are super important. And when we say a supplement, we mean a lick tub, or they have liquid lick, and salt blocks. I mean, it can be as simple as a salt block. But the stress of that environment there's a toll on your animal that they are going to need a supplement for.
Yeah, and you do know that in some cases, if the drought's really hitting strong and you get a lot of that grass is drying up, a lot of that is not usable to the cow as much unless you have a supplement, some way to buffer that a little bit.
Convert it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with the rumen and the cow, if we're talking about cows, they're going to need something so that they can convert it to usable energy. So, and then last, maybe a backup pasture. I mean, we're talking about huge fires. Juan, maybe visit a little bit about that.
Yeah, this can probably be part of the emergency management plan. If you don't have one, maybe we can start writing that down, is to have what plan do you have available for your association or industry, to see what backup you have available. Are you going to buy hay? Are you going to have a tribe pay for hay for you? Or you have already business already lined up for you to supplement those items that you need, especially during fire or even drought times?
Perfect. Okay, next, Ruby. So I'll go back to that last picture. So this is a really good example of my ranch. And so you can see hay in the background that we have put up so we can feed it when it's a winter month. And that's our situation. But every situation is different. Okay, next. Do you have another source of income to supplement your operations? So it is really important when you're starting out to have the support of your family, meaning, does your spouse have another job, an off the ranch job or source of income? Because when you're starting out, it does not cash flow. This is very important to understand. It's why we are spending so much time on the finances in this series, because it's so important to understand the series as the financial side of it before you get into it. Also, an emergency fund. You just heard Juan talk about an emergency plan in case you get a fire, but also an emergency fund in so we're going into a situation during the COVID where you may need to keep an emergency fund to get through this fall if cattle prices are low. But in general, your emergency fund is for when cattle prices are low, so you can get through the year. Also, funds from past grants, insurance, and loans. You know, how can you use those to benefit your ranch? Trent, talk a little bit about this, please.
Yeah, so a couple of things, like an emergency fund, we talked about that the last webinar, is having that backup, having that little buffers to where you're not going to get in a bind. A lot of times you will get funds from If you're participating in grants with folks, you have some funds. Insurance, there's a lot of livestock and range insurance options out there, as long as you can control the land and work with that. Those do pay out, but remember, they are insurance, so they're payments for when things go wrong. And it's not 100% coverage. It's a percentage of that, but it's a way to help you if you have to all of a sudden buy a lot of hay. Those programs are there. Now, there is sometimes a cost up front of that, but not always on these the federal insurance programs. So, but they're important to know that. And then you do have these loans, and those are emergency loans, operating loans, these other kind of things to get you through, because it's not all going to come in a timely manner exactly when you need it, right? So ranching,
Right.
the flow of the funds coming in doesn't always match all the flow of the funds going out. We talked about that jar last time, and I think Ruby's going to talk about that again. So it's really important to try to balance that flow so you're not strapped and getting in a bind on that. And that's what, these are kind of potential funds you could use on that. But like we talked about that emergency fund out front on the last webinar, it's to get you through those rough times, and that's what you're looking for.
Well, and really what I want to circle back around to is that our next one will be on the Wi-Fi app, or what is it?
It's a finance use,
yes, MiFi app. And so that's where you need to put in your information. Ruby's going to talk about that next, but just give an overview right now.
So, yeah, so this one, this number 8 question is, do you have access to credit? And last week we did a webinar on using the MiFi app. It's short for My Financial Assistance. And so that webinar is on the Facebook page and also on the University of Arizona Tribal Extension website. So, but it's one way to look at just put that credit, you know, what does it mean to you? Because I think when we start to look at loans and credit and stuff, it's difficult to understand kind of what it really means. And so you can pick an item like your head of calves. And then if you borrow certain amounts of money, it'll tell you how many calves you'd have to sell to meet those loan payments. And so it can put it into terms that make a difference. You can say, well, if I buy this and I borrow this money, where am I going to get that many calves to sell to do it? Or is this going to help me have that many extra calves? And so here we're talking about being a friend or enemy. A lot of times you need some access to credit for having a ranching operation. But if sometimes a banker may say, oh, you qualify for all this extra money, but if you borrow all that extra money, you have to pay it back. And so that just makes it harder to be profitable because you've spent more money because you borrowed it, and now you have more money to pay back. And so you have to watch it and stuff. So last week we did some webinars where we kind of talked about how you really need to keep track of your expenses and also look at your situation and stuff. But when we were doing the app, we also brought up some examples of some payday loans. So one reason to say, do I have access to credit here, is that it may be more time consuming and more difficult to go through like something like USDA's Farm Service Agency, your local FSA office, to get one of their loans, but the interest rate maybe only be 2 or 3%, where if you're using a credit card to try to run a ranching operation, that interest rate could be up to like 20% or higher. And that makes it a lot more difficult to pay that loan back and to make it cash flow. And then we even saw some extreme examples of people using payday loans. And the payday loans sometimes paid more in interest for a week for that money than what you would pay in multiple years for using FSA funds.
Yeah.
And so that's why we just kind of say it can be a friend or an enemy, because once you get involved in some of those really high interest rate things, it's really hard to get them paid back in because you're spending so much time in interest.
Exactly. Okay, thank you, Ruby. Okay, number 9, do you plan to eventually live solely off the cattle operation income? So many, and I can't stress this enough, many ranches have another source of income. You have to know that going in. It is very important. Also, is this a hobby? So I think that's also important that you understand. You may think that 30 head is gonna, give you an income for your whole life, but or for your year, I'm sorry. But I think that that's why we're going back to our finances so much, because if you have 30 head and they're selling off at $1,000 and we're doing calves, you have a $30,000 income a year. But does it cost $15,000 to run them? So it's very important that you understand the cost of business. Trent?
Yeah, so if you did that, like what the example Vicky just was given there, so you may have a max of $30,000 income, but what happens like with herd health if you lose one calf, or if your feed prices go up, or if your interest rate's higher? So you have to balance and understand where you're at on that, and what your objective of having those animals is. Where is that fit in with you and with your family? And sometimes it's nice to have animals out there, right? You want a few cows as it's just a comfort, having the animals there. So, and that's fine. That's really fine. Just understand what it is and where the money. You still have to track money coming in now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which
Also,
really brings, Juan, go ahead.
yeah. Also, it's very important if you're getting insurance money from association or from a USDA grant or any industry. It's very important not to rely on that, but to save that just in case something else happened the following year. It's something that we consider.
Yeah.
And that's back to our emergency funds. So, and then it really comes down to how much of your household income are you willing to put at risk? So even if you have a job and you're getting paid $30,000, I mean, are you willing to take some of that and sacrifice some of the things that you love to do and put it towards your livestock?
Yeah, and then I think people know examples of this all over the place, on-off nations. It doesn't really matter. If you have small herds of small groups of animals out there that you're managing, but you both have off-farm, off-ranch incomes,
Yeah.
and you're really tracking where the money's coming in and out, you realize how much you're really subsidizing this. Now, if things are really tight in a household, and we haven't shorn up our personal finance like we talked about before, these can start to be this hidden drain that you never see. And so you're all of a sudden running really short on money and you're wondering what's going on. So
Yeah.
you need to be careful, because that will impact your home, your household, your family, right? So that's important to get.
Perfect. All right, Ruby, to our last slide on our numbered. All right, so now we're gonna circle back around, and I'm gonna rely on Ruby and Trent for this. They're our economists. And it's, do you know how much cash flow it'll take to make that happen? Now we're gonna just very briefly go over this in this webinar, because we have the one in the previous week, and our next webinar will focus on this as well. Ruby.
So yeah, so the webinar that starts in the next hour at 3 o'clock for me here in Mountain Time Zone, but at 2 o'clock in the Arizona time zone, will be on really kind of looking at that financial side and giving you some tools to manage the financial analysis. But I think that you need to know, like, what is your comfort level? And I think this gets back to a little bit what Trent was saying about your family versus your business. How comfortable are you putting your family's money at risk? What is the minimum amount that your family needs to live on and you're comfortable with living with? And so you really have to start there and then say, how can I make that happen? And it really is different for everybody, and it's different for every situation. Even you can have two ranches that are side by side, but they may have very different family situations. They may have different other situations. And so what they take may have different types of operations. And so it really comes down to keeping track of what you want to do in your records. And the more you do that, then the better you can be at making these decisions. Trent, do you want to add anything?
It just what Rue is saying, and what I was kind of alluding to at the last one, is you don't want, if you are really want to have animals, want to have cattle in there, you want to do it right, you want to do what's right for the animals, the horses, and your family. So understanding where those levels are so you're not putting either one in jeopardy will allow you to have those animals and what you want there. And that's the whole goal, is to get what you want out of this, what those animals bring to you, bring to your house. You don't want them to be a drain. You want them to be part of it. And that's, I think, the trick. And that's where you need to find that comfort level. That's what we're talking about. There's a certain amount of risk in ag. That's just inherent to ag, right? You have the weather, you have prices, you have all sorts of things that sometimes you just don't see coming, like the COVID, right?
Yeah.
It's all that coming, impact on the packing houses, impact on the distribution
The
system.
market.
Yeah, so you have to be aware of that, and that there's just a certain amount of risk you're really gonna, it's hard to control, but being in a place where you're aware and have a little buffer in there and you know what that comfort level is really key to get through those kind of things.
And the webinars from last week, I think, can be places to help you get started with some of the record keeping and some of the other things for you to help start to determine what are your cash flow needs and how much is it going to take to do it. And then the next webinar that we have today will kind of tell you kind of how much information do you need to really start looking at different options and different analyzing your financial situation. And so they're really kind of building on each other. You don't have to be perfect at knowing all of this, and it can be really intimidating, but just start to, you know, put some things down on paper. And that's what these 10 questions are meant to be, is just we'll start with some basics and start to get stuff down on paper for each one of them. For each one of these, you know, kind of list what your plan is, or what do you need to find out? What's your next step?
Let's go to our next slide, please. Okay, so this is what Ruby's talking about. So as you go through this, it's kind of a checklist, and we want to work on making the answers to these questions a yes. If they're not a yes, do some research, do your homework, write your steps down, meaning who do I need to call? How do I figure this out? Do I need to drive down my fence? Do I need to ride down my fence if I have a horse? Check what you have. And then revisit your goals. Do they align with all of these? This is not impossible, and you don't have to do all of it at once. We are not trying to overwhelm you. We are trying to take this step by step. But as you have goals, if you will revisit our webinar from last week, we talked about goals and like marking them off as you achieve them. Ruby?
Yes, and I was just going to say that sometimes when we go through this, it almost sounds, you know, overwhelming, like we're saying, you know, give up on your dream. I don't think you have to give up on your dreams. I just think that we can make the dreams better and shift things around. So if it doesn't look like it works the way you might have envisioned it after, you know, hearing these questions and stuff, just shift that around. And that's what it says, revisit your goals and stuff. And so just shift things around. And I've told people that it's way more fun to lose money on paper than to lose money in reality. And so part of this is just helping you lose it on paper and be able to shift those and make something that'll work on paper before doing it in reality.
Absolutely.
And come up with the different options that may work. I mean, if there is a barrier that you run into that you didn't expect, it's better to find that out ahead of time and then say, oh, so I need to go around this or do something about this. What are my options? And you get that lined out. So you tackle those potential barriers up front. Because in the end, we want you to succeed with this and be happy and be successful at it. So we're trying to find those little barriers and those little blockages that you're going to run into. No doubt, you're going to run into these things, and you're not going to catch them all either. There's going to be some things.
And we're definitely not trying to set you up for failure. So some of this seems very prohibitive of you doing this, but we are just challenging you to look at all aspects so that you will succeed.
Yeah,
And I
in some
think that-
associations,
go ahead.
in some associations, or even the business already has a strategic management plan, and maybe just going over them, seeing what you already have available, what's already been done, what needs to be updated. It could be maps, could be operations, anything that you need already might be already be there.
Yeah,
Perfect.
Yeah. Good point.
Okay, next slide, Ruby. All right, so any questions, please feel free to contact any of us. And we are going to wrap it up now. And we will have the next webinar in 15 minutes. All of these are available, recording. Just let us know what you need. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.